The prairie night of September 27, 1965, was a deep velvet black over the town of Medford, Kansas, population 1203. It was a place where the horizon was a straight line, and the sky, unpolluted by city lights, was a breathtaking tapestry of stars. The air was cool and carried the dry, sweet scent of harvested wheat and sun-baked earth. On Main Street, the diner had closed at 9, the final patrons having left with full stomachs and the day's gossip. The only lights still burning were in the town's two-story brick schoolhouse, where the high school football team was practicing for Friday's big game against their rivals from Coates, and in the living rooms of a few dozen homes where families were gathered around black and white televisions, watching the fuzzy images of the Andy Griffith Show. At 10:17 p.m., the crickets stopped chirping. It was a silence so abrupt and total that it was, in itself, a sound, a premonition. Then came the rumble. It did not start as a sound, but as a feeling, a deep, subsonic vibration that traveled up through the foundations of houses, through the soles of shoes, into the very marrow of the bone. It was the feeling of the planet itself groaning. Pictures rattled on walls. Water in drinking glasses shivered into concentric rings. Within 2 seconds, the rumble became a roar. It was not the crack of thunder, which splits the sky, but a rolling, grinding, tearing noise that seemed to erupt from the very bowels of the earth. It was the sound of bedrock being sundered. And then the ground moved. It didn't shake, it lifted. For a terrifying, impossible moment, the entire town felt a single, violent heave, as if a giant had taken a fistful of the Kansas prairie and shoved it upwards. On Maple Street, old Mrs. Henderson, who was washing her supper dishes, saw her kitchen floor tile crack in a zigzag line from the back door to the icebox. In the high school gym, the basketball nets swayed violently, though there was no wind. The sound arrived a split second later, a physical force. It was a pressure wave that hit the town like a wall of solid air. Every window on the north and west sides of every building simultaneously dissolved. They didn't shatter and fall inwards, they vaporized into a billion crystalline particles that blew outward into the night, as if the town itself were exhaling its own soul. The sound of it was a single, sharp, all-encompassing crack that deafened the world. Lights flickered and died as power lines snapped. Car alarms, a technology still in its infancy, began a frantic, discordant symphony. Dogs, who had been whining moments before, were now barking in a frenzy of primal fear. From the darkness came the first screams, not of pain, but of sheer, uncomprehending terror. The people of Medford stumbled from their homes into the night now filled with a fine, settling dust that smelled of ozone and crushed rock, staring north into the darkness from which the apocalypse had come. 2 miles north of the Medford city limit, hidden in a sea of swaying wheat, was Site 12B. To any farmer or passing motorist, it was just a collection of unremarkable low-slung concrete buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence. There were no dramatic towers, no obvious launch doors. The only hint of its true nature was the exceptional quality of the gravel access road and the U.S. government property no trespassing signs, posted every 100 yards. Site 12B was an Atlas F coffin silo. Part of the 550th Strategic Missile Squadron, it was one of a ring of such sites built in the early 1960s to form America's first credible intercontinental ballistic missile deterrent. The Atlas was a monster, 82 feet tall, a stainless steel-skinned behemoth fueled by a volatile cocktail of liquid oxygen and RP-1 kerosene. Its design was ingenious and terrifying. The entire silo was a giant elevator. The missile was stored horizontally, underground, in a reinforced concrete coffin. When the launch order came, Massive hydraulic rams would raise it to the surface in a dizzying 60 seconds. The silo doors would blast open, and the rocket would ignite, its fiery breath scorching the Kansas earth as it began its arc towards the Soviet Union. But by 1965, the Atlas was already obsolete, replaced by more stable, solid-fueled Minuteman missiles. The decommissioning process was underway. On paper, as of October 1964, Site 12B was listed as inactive. Its official records stated it was empty, its missile removed, its fuel drained. The Strategic Air Command had moved on. The reality inside the fence was very different. Decommissioning a weapon of such complexity was not a simple matter of turning a key and walking away. The process was slow, bureaucratic, and fraught with logistical challenges. On the night of September 27th, Site 12B was in a state of dangerous limbo. The missile, Atlas number 12B-804, was still there. It lay in its subterranean cradle, its warhead removed, but its fuel tanks were not empty. They were nearly full. A skeleton crew of 6 Air Force technicians and 1 young, ambitious lieutenant, fresh from officer training, were on site. Their job was to run a series of final systems checks and slowly, carefully transfer the highly volatile liquid oxygen and RP-1 kerosene into specialized tanker trucks for disposal. It was delicate, nerve-wracking work. Liquid oxygen, or LOX, boiled at minus 297 degrees Fahrenheit. It was an unforgiving oxidizer. Any contamination, any spark, any sudden pressure change, and it would combine with its fuel in an explosive reunion of breathtaking violence. The silo was a cathedral of Cold War anxiety. The air was cold and carried the metallic tang of machinery and the faint, sweet smell of rocket fuel. The hum of ventilation systems and the low thrum electrical generators were the constant soundtrack. The men who worked here were the unspoken guardians of the apocalypse, and the weight of that responsibility was a presence as tangible as the 165-ton rocket sleeping in its pit. 3 weeks earlier, Airman Second Class Frank Kelso, a 22-year-old fuel systems technician from Tulsa, had been running a standard pressure integrity test on the LOX transfer lines. A meticulous man with a mechanic's intuitive understanding of machinery, Kelso noticed an anomaly. The pressure in one of the secondary feed lines was dropping faster than the specs allowed. A minuscule drop, barely a blip on the gauge, but it was consistent. It indicated a leak, not a gusher, but a seep, a tiny, almost imperceptible weep of supercooled liquid oxygen somewhere in the complex plumbing that fed the missile's massive oxidizer tank. He logged it. He filed the standard Form 341 Maintenance Discrepancy Report and submitted it to his immediate superior, Technical Sergeant Vernon Moss. Moss, a career airman with 18 years in, was a competent technician, but a man worn down by the system. He looked at Kelso's report, at the tiny pressure variance, and sighed. He knew what it meant. A confirmed leak, no matter how small, would trigger a stand-down order. All fuel transfer operations would halt. A specialized repair team from Boeing, the prime contractor, would have to be flown in. There would be investigations, reports, and endless questions from command. The decommissioning schedule, already behind, would be set back by weeks, maybe months. And Sergeant Moss was tired. He was 2 years from a full pension. He wanted a clean, quiet end to his tour at this godforsaken silo. He looked at the young, earnest face of Airman Kelso and made a calculation. "Son," he said, tapping the form on his metal desk, "this is within the margin of error for these old gauges. The ambient temperature fluctuation in the silo is enough to account for this. I'm not grounding the entire operation for a ghost in the machine." Kelso protested. "Sarge, the spec is clear. Any drop outside of—" "The spec was written by engineers in air-conditioned offices," Moss interrupted. his voice taking on an edge of finality. "I've seen 100 of these. It's nothing. We'll keep an eye on it. Now get back to your post. We've got a transfer scheduled for 1600 hours." The Form 341 was marked "No action required" and filed away, in a drawer destined for the shredder. The leak, a tiny weeping artery in the heart of a sleeping giant, continued. Over the next 3 weeks, the slow, constant seep of LOX did its work. It pooled in an undrained conduit. It soaked into the insulation around the pipes. It created an invisible, oxygen-rich atmosphere in a confined space, deep within the silo's support structure. It was a patient gathering storm. On the night of September 27th, as the final fuel transfer of the day was being prepared, a spark was born. It came from a worn electrical relay in a pump motor, a component that had passed its last inspection. It was a tiny blue-white flicker of electricity, insignificant in any other environment. But in the oxygen-saturated air around the leaking LOX line, it was a key turning in the lock of hell. The spark found the fuel-rich vapor. There was a whoomp that was not loud but profound, the sound of the air itself catching fire. This initial flash fire raced back along the vapor trail, following the path of the leak like a fuse on a powder keg, back to its source. It reached the pooled liquid oxygen. The world turned white. The explosion was not a single event, but a cascading catastrophe. The initial fuel air blast ruptured the adjacent RP1 kerosene line. The two fuels, now liberated from their pipes, mingled in the air and ignited in a proper chemical fireball. This fireball, expanding at supersonic speed, found the main missile fuel tanks. The 165-ton Atlas missile did not explode like a bomb. It unmade itself. Its stainless steel skin, designed to withstand the rigors of spaceflight, was torn apart like tissue paper by the overpressure. Its thousands of gallons of propellant ignited in a sympathetic detonation, a deflagration so rapid and so complete, it was, for all intents and purposes, a nuclear-scale conventional explosion. The 740-ton reinforced concrete lid of the silo, designed to withstand a near miss from a Soviet warhead, was not merely blown off, it was pulverized. The ground above the silo did not collapse, it erupted. A crater over 300 feet wide and 100 feet deep was instantly carved out of the Kansas wheat field. The seismic shockwave registered as a magnitude 4.7 earthquake in Denver. The fireball lit up the night sky, visible for 100 miles, a false, terrible dawn that painted the clouds in shades of orange and hellish purple. In Medford, the force of the blast wave that shattered the windows was followed by a rain of debris, chunks of concrete, twisted steel, and scorched earth that fell from the sky for a full minute. The northern part of town closest to the silo was scoured by the shock wave. Houses had their roofs torn off, barns were flattened, and the old grain elevator was left leaning at a drunken angle. The official response was swift, shrouded in the impenetrable blanket of national security. The Air Force cordoned off the area. Men in uniform, their faces grim, went door to door, not to offer aid, but to deliver non-disclosure agreements and warnings about the consequences of speaking to the press. The story was contained. It was reported as a massive industrial accident at a closed government facility. The words missile and silo were never uttered. But the people of Medford knew. They had felt the ground open. They had seen the false sun rise in the north. They lived with the scars, the boarded-up windows, the cracked foundations, and the lingering fear in the eyes of their children. They had been brushed by the wing of the very apocalypse their government had built in their backyard to protect them from. And in the quiet of the Kansas night, if you listen closely, the wind still seems to carry the echo of a secret that was almost lost, and an explosion so violent it tried to erase a town from the map and from memory. The silence in the silo was a lie. It was the silence of a coiled spring, of a drawn breath held for too long. The air, thick with the sweet, cloying odor of RP1 and the metallic chill of boiling-off liquid oxygen, was awaiting explosive. Deep within the labyrinth of pipes and conduits surrounding the Atlas missile, the tiny, persistent leak from the faulty transfer line had done its work. It had transformed the space into a bomb's crucible, the oxygen-rich atmosphere a perfect oxidizer for the slightest ignition source. That source came at 0217. In a junction box near pump assembly B12, a relay, its contacts worn and pitted from 1,000 cycles, snapped shut to activate a secondary coolant pump. It was a routine action, one that happened dozens of times a day. But this time, as the contacts met, a microscopic arc of electricity jumped the gap. In a normal environment, it would have been harmless, a tiny blue spark, unseen and unheard. In the oxygen-saturated air of the silo, it was a match thrown into a gas-filled room. There was no warning rumble. The initial ignition was a whump, a deep, visceral compression of the air that was felt rather than heard. It was the sound of the atmosphere itself catching fire. A flash fire, incandescent and furious, raced through the conduit, following the trail of vaporized LOX back to its source like a fuse burning at impossible speed. It reached the pooled liquid oxygen in a fraction of a second. The pool did not burn, it detonated. The initial blast was contained for a microsecond by the steel and concrete of the silo substructure. This containment focused the energy, channeling it. The resulting fireball, a sphere of sun-core temperature, expanded upward, seeking the path of least resistance, the 175-foot vertical shaft of the silo itself. It shot upwards like a piston of pure hellfire, accelerating as it went. The temperature inside the shaft soared to over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The steel gantry work, the cabling, the lightning arresters, everything lining the silo walls vaporized instantly. At the top of this shaft were the silo doors, two interlocking, reinforced concrete slabs, each weighing 125 tons, engineered to survive everything but a direct nuclear hit. They were not designed for an explosion from within. The upward rushing column of superheated gas and plasma hit them with the force of a primordial god. The massive steel hinges, each the size of a man's torso, did not bend, they shattered into shrapnel. The locks, designed to withstand a pressure of 500 pounds per square inch, failed catastrophically. The doors were not simply blown open, they were launched. One slab was hurled skyward like a child's toy, spinning end over end, a grotesque concrete coin tossed against the starry Kansas sky. It landed nearly half a mile away, plowing a 10-foot deep furrow into a farmer's field, where it would lie for days, too hot to approach, a smoldering monument to the violence below. The other door, fractured into 3 massive chunks, was blasted laterally, skidding and tumbling across the scrubland, crushing the security fence and one of the outbuildings into splinters and twisted metal. With its lid violently removed, the silo vomited its contents into the night. A column of fire, now mixed with a distinctive orange-black smoke of burning kerosene, roared 1,000 feet into the air, a sudden, terrible volcano on the plains. In Medford, the initial ground lift was followed by the sound, a roaring, tearing cataclysm that seemed to go on forever. But then came the light. The fireball, rising from the epicenter 2 miles north, illuminated the landscape with the intensity of a noonday sun, but a sun gone mad. It was a sickly, pulsating orange-yellow, and it cast long, dancing, demonic shadows that shot across the town. The heat reached the town's edge seconds later. It was not the gentle warmth of a summer day, but a dry, searing blast, like the opening of a colossal furnace door. On Oak Street, the northernmost residential lane, paint on the clapboard houses blistered and peeled, vinyl siding warped and melted, dripping like black wax. The leaves on the ancient elm trees were instantly scorched brown, curling and falling in a silent preternatural rain. Then the debris began to fall. It started with the fine dust, pulverized concrete and soil that fell like gray snow, coating everything in a gritty, choking film. Then came the larger pieces, chunks of reinforced concrete, some as large as refrigerators, smashed through roofs and crushed cars parked in driveways. Twisted fragments of steel rebar, still hot to the touch, speared into lawns and sidewalks like javelins. A section of the missile's stainless steel skin, curled into a bizarre metallic flower by the force of the blast, sliced through the roof of the Miller family's garage and embedded itself in their station wagon. The northern neighborhood, known locally as The Addition, bore the brunt of the hellish rainfall. The Johnson House at 241 Oak Street took a direct hit from a chunk of the silo's foundation. The structure didn't just collapse, it was obliterated. Reduced to a pile of splintered lumber and shattered brick, the foundation slab scraped clean as if by a giant's hand. Next door, the Carlsons' home was set ablaze by a piece of still smoldering insulation, burning so fiercely that the fire department, when it finally arrived, could do nothing but watch it be consumed. The terror was absolute. Families who had fled their homes now huddled in basements or ditches, covering their heads as the sky continued to fall, the roaring of the fire column a constant, deafening backdrop. The world had ended, and it had ended in their backyards. In the days that followed, as the dust literally settled, the full geographic impact became clear. The northern part of Medford was a war zone. But one area was different. It wasn't just damaged, it was gone. On pre-1965 Sanborn fire insurance maps, the area designated as Block C on the original town plat shows a neat grid of 12 residential lots with houses, sheds, and mature trees clearly marked. It was a quiet, working-class street of post-war bungalows, home to factory workers, retired farmers, and young families. After September 27th, Block C ceased to exist. The force of the blast wave, channeled by a slight depression in the landscape, had scoured the block with the efficiency of a sandblaster. The houses were not merely knocked down, they were disassembled. Wood was splintered into kindling, glass ground into powder, and personal belongings, furniture, photographs, children's toys, were shredded and scattered across the county. The foundations were cracked and shifted, some pushed inward, as if by a giant thumb. The trees were stripped bare, their branches torn away, their trunks left as skeletal, scarred sentinels. What remained was a grotesque, empty lot littered with unrecognizable debris. It looked less like a neighborhood after a disaster and more like an archaeological site of a civilization that had been violently erased. Within a month, surveyors with federal IDs appeared, stringing new lines. Soon after, official notices were quietly delivered to the owners of the destroyed properties, those who had survived and had been staying with relatives or in motels. The notices did not offer sympathy or aid. They offered a buyout. The price was fair, even generous, but it was non-negotiable. The area, the documents stated, was now zoned as uninhabitable due to subsurface instability and impact zone contamination. The title was to be signed over to the U.S. government. There was no option to rebuild. There was no discussion. One by one, the families of Block C, their lives already shattered, signed the papers. They took the money and left. Their homes, their history, and their community vanished as completely as if they had never been. The land was graded, covered with fresh topsoil, and seeded with grass. Today, it is an empty field, a strangely quiet park at the edge of town that the children of Medford are subtly warned away from. It is a void on the map, a ghost in the town's memory, a place where the government paid to have a secret buried, along with the foundations of 12 homes. The first official vehicles did not have sirens. They arrived in a swift, silent convoy, their headlights cutting through the dust-hazed darkness. They were not police cars or fire trucks. They were Air Force security vehicles, painted in dull olive drab, and they moved with a chilling, predetermined efficiency. Within 10 minutes of the explosion, every road leading into or out of Medford was sealed. Jeeps and trucks were positioned at the highway on-ramp, at the county road junctions, and at the end of the gravel lane that led to the silo itself. Air policemen, their faces set in grim masks, stood with rifles, not merely directing traffic, but blocking all movement. Their orders were simple: no one in, no one out. Inside the town, the lockdown was just as absolute. Squads of APs in pairs moved from house to house, their knocks on the doors sharp and authoritative. They did not ask if anyone was hurt. They did not offer assistance. Their script was brief and left no room for questions. "Sir, ma'am, by order of the United States Air Force, you are to remain indoors until further notice. Do not attempt to leave the area. Do not use your telephone. This is a matter of national security." When people, shocked and terrified, stammered questions, "What happened? Is it the Russians? My mother lives in Coates. I need to call her," the response was a stone wall. "I cannot answer that, sir. You are to remain indoors." They moved with the cold impersonality of machines, their eyes seeing everything and giving nothing away. The town was cut off from the world. The phone lines, those that were still operational, went dead, deliberately cut at the junction box by a communications team. The sense of isolation was profound. Medford was now an island, a prison, the site of a catastrophe that its own government would not even name. The only sounds were the distant, dying roar of the silo fire and the crunch of military boots on broken glass, a sound that promised not rescue, but silence. The secret of Site 12B was to be contained, and the people of Medford were now part of the containment. The 3 days that followed the explosion were a period of surreal, military-controlled limbo for the people of Medford. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a gnawing anxiety and a profound sense of violation. Their town was no longer their own. It was an occupied territory. The air policemen remained at their posts, their faces unreadable, their orders unchanging. No one entered, no one left. The world outside might as well have ceased to exist. The sounds of the cleanup began on the first night. They were the sounds of industry, not of rescue. The distant guttural roar of heavy diesel engines echoed across the flatlands, a sound that started after sunset and continued until just before dawn. From their windows, peering through boarded-up panes, residents could see the flicker of portable arc lights to the north, casting the silhouettes of massive machines against the low-hanging smoke and dust that still shrouded the blast site. They were not the lights of a recovery operation searching for survivors. They were the lights of a forensic team sanitizing a crime scene. A convoy of vehicles, unlike any ever seen in Pratt County, had rolled in under cover of darkness. There were massive M-Series tractor-trailers hauling flatbeds laden with bulldozers and excavators painted in the same dull olive drab as the security forces. Water tankers designed for decontamination sprayed down the access roads, turning the dust to mud. Most ominously, there were unmarked windowless vans and a mobile laboratory unit, all operating with a quiet, frantic urgency. The work was methodical and brutally efficient. The colossal crater, a raw, smoking wound in the earth, was the primary target. Excavators, their buckets the size of small cars, first pushed the scattered debris, the twisted steel that was once the gantry, the chunks of concrete from the silo walls, the unrecognizable fragments of the missile itself, back into the pit. It was a macabre burial. Then, fleets of dump trucks, arriving in a continuous rumbling procession, began dumping thousands of tons of clean fill dirt and gravel, shipped in from a quarry 50 miles away. The dozers worked around the clock, spreading and compacting the material in layers. The goal was not to memorialize, but to erase, to make the whole disappear. Simultaneously, other teams fanned out across the northern approaches to town. Wearing protective suits and using Geiger counters and chemical sniffers, they methodically grid-searched the fields and the devastated neighborhoods. Every piece of debris, no matter how small, was cataloged and bagged. A twisted piece of aluminum that might have been part of the missile's skin, bagged and sent to a waiting truck. A chunk of circuitry, bagged. The personal effects of the families from Block C, scattered to the winds, they were not returned. They were treated as potential evidence, as contaminants. Photographs, toys, pieces of clothing, all of it was collected, not for sentimental return, but for secure disposal. They were scrubbing the landscape of any trace of the technology that had failed so catastrophically. By the dawn of the third day, the transformation was staggering. The crater was gone. In its place was a vast, flat, barren field of freshly turned earth, already surrounded by a new, taller chain-link fence, topped with barbed wire. The scorched trees had been felled and removed. The shattered outbuildings of the silo complex were gone, their foundations dug up and filled in. It looked, for all the world, like a large, empty, and newly cleared construction site. The violence of 72 hours prior had been physically buried. It was only then that the lockdown was partially lifted. A single, carefully worded statement was released to the local newspaper, the Medford Courier, which was itself heavily leaned on by men in civilian clothes but with military bearing. The statement attributed the event to a catastrophic failure of a high-pressure fuel storage tank at a decommissioned government facility. It expressed regret for any disturbance or property damage and stated that all appropriate safety measures were being reviewed. The words missile, silo, explosion, and atlas were conspicuously absent. The story was a bland, anodyne lie, designed to be forgotten. For the people of Medford, the official story was a bitter pill. They knew what they had felt. They had seen the fireball, felt the ground heave, and witnessed the scoured earth devastation of Block C. They lived with the constant, physical reminder of the empty field where their neighbors' homes once stood. But in the America of 1965, you did not challenge the official word of the U.S. government, especially when it was wrapped in the flag of national security. A quiet, resentful silence descended over the town. The event became the thing nobody talked about, a ghost in the community psyche. The truth began to seep out like groundwater through cracked clay, slowly and in fragments. It started in the late 1990s with the declassification of millions of pages of Cold War documents. Historians and journalists, piecing together the puzzle, began filing Freedom of Information Act requests for records pertaining to Site 12B and Atlas F incidents. The released documents were heavily redacted, but what remained was damning. Internal Air Force memos from the weeks before the explosion confirmed Airman Kelso's leak report and its suppression by Technical Sergeant Moss. The official Accident Investigation Board's report, once deemed top secret, contained chilling technical details. It calculated the yield of the explosion. The simultaneous detonation of the nearly full load of RP-1 kerosene and liquid oxygen created a fuel-air explosive effect of terrifying efficiency. The board estimated the blast had released energy equivalent to 0.2 kilotons of TNT. The number was staggering. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima had a yield of 15 kilotons. The Medford explosion, a conventional accident, had released the power of a small tactical nuclear weapon. This was not a fuel storage incident, it was an event of geological power. The report soberly noted that the force was more than sufficient to vaporize the immediate silo infrastructure and create significant topographical alteration and collateral damage at a radius of up to 2 miles. It was the clinical, bureaucratic confirmation that the destruction of Block C was not an unfortunate side effect. It was the direct, predictable result of a weapon of mass destruction detonating in their midst. The most haunting revelations came from the town's own records, which had been quietly altered. A comparison of pre- and post-1965 zoning maps showed the literal cartographic erasure of Block C. The neat rectangular plot of land was simply gone, absorbed into a larger, undefined utility zone. Property tax records for those addresses ended abruptly in 1965 with a single cryptic notation: eminent domain, federal acquisition. The money for the buyouts, it was later discovered, did not come from a standard disaster relief fund, but from a covert Pentagon budget line used for weapons program liability and site remediation. The truth was this: the United States government had built a doomsday weapon in the Kansas wheat fields. Through a combination of negligence and bureaucratic cowardice, that weapon had accidentally armed itself and detonated with the force of a small nuclear bomb. And when it did, that same government had not only failed to warn the citizens in its path, but had then marched in, imposed martial law, buried the evidence, forcibly purchased the land it had destroyed, and lied to the world about what had happened. The blast at Site 12B didn't just destroy a silo, it erased a piece of Medford, and for decades, it erased the truth. The story that remains is not one of a simple industrial accident, but a chilling lesson in the hidden costs of the Cold War, a tale of a town that was sacrificed not to a foreign enemy, but to its own country's secrets, and a crater in the earth and in the human heart that was filled in with dirt and silence.